Greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome Katie back to JANM. Most of you have been around JANM for a lot longer than I have, so your memory and your relationship with Katie goes back a lot longer than mine. But I first met Katie in 2015 when I was still with Amnesty, and this was Katie in her guise as this extraordinary muralist. And we brought her along with 12 other muralists from around the world to paint these extraordinary murals in New Orleans. And the subject of each was somebody who'd been imprisoned unjustly. So Katie, along with these extraordinary muralists from all over the world, spent this 1 week intensive time with all of us in New Orleans. And that was before I came to JANM. And who would know that when I came to JANM, I would have a richer relationship with Katie. So, it's such a pleasure to welcome her back here into this space. And it's also so wonderful for me to be able to continue that thread of that relationship. Some of you know Katie as an author and an illustrator of children's books. Many of you also know her as a muralist. She's done, I think, over 80 murals all around the world, looking at issues of identity and social justice. And she's also, so much of her passion is around gender issues, around women's issues, around the injustice against women. And that is a critical theme that you see running through all her work. So it's just enormously exciting to have her back. And for those of you who don't know, behind our National Center for the Preservation of Democracy is an incredibly beautiful mural that Katie painted in 2014, Moon Beholders. And of course, she came with the artist's eye and thought, needs a touch-up. So that's what she's planning to do at the end of this program. But for the time that we have her here in this space, Katie, it's wonderful to have you back. Come on in and tell us about your new book. Let's all welcome Katie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm so thrilled to be here back at JANM. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I came in yesterday, and I'm really looking forward to sharing my new book, Shapes, Lines, and Light, My Grandfather's American Journey, with you all today. Something funny that's been happening with this book, with these events, which is happening right now, is that sometimes I'll do the book with hundreds of school children. Sometimes I'll do it where the audience is 99% over the age of 30 or 40 or 50. So I hope that you'll kind of engage with me as we go through the program. I find that with this story, as I kind of worked through my grandfather's journey, I ended up with more questions than answers. And I know that so many of you share so much of the same history that my family's been through. And I'm interested in your input and your feedback as well. So just to start out, I grew up north of Detroit. My grandfather eventually moved out north of Detroit to have his practice. And I'm one of 8 grandchildren. He had 3 children. And I grew up kind of knowing a lot about the fact that he was kind of this famous architect. I knew that he had designed the World Trade Center. Everybody knew, oh, your grandpa designed the Twin Towers. But where we lived was really different than where he grew up. He grew up in Seattle. He was born in Seattle, in Nihonmachi, where he was, one of many Nisei children in this community. The home that his parents lived in was on the original Skid Row, where trees, lumber would slide down next to their home, and they didn't have any indoor plumbing. He was the oldest of 2 boys. And his father had come from Japan because he was the second-born son. So although they were kind of from a farming family where they had a lot of land, everything that was to be inherited was going to go to his brother. So he said, I'm going to come to the United States and start here. So my grandfather was born in the early 1900s. And what I knew about him growing up, was this, his greatest professional achievement. But it was a little confusing because where we lived was in this kind of factory town north of Detroit, where the entire economy of our town was based on the auto industry, right? So I was born in 1976. So, in the early 1980s, Vincent Chin was murdered. The auto industry was going into recession, and we were very much, you would see bumper stickers on cars that would say things like "Jap crap," and it would have like a picture of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes peeing on those words. And my teachers would say things to my parents like, "Oh, your kids are smart because you eat fish. Your kids are smart because, they're Japanese." And my thought was, well, maybe you should eat some fish too. Maybe, it was pretty, it was a specifically anti-Japanese community that we grew up in, which was strange. But my parents were kind of like back to the land hippies. So we actually had within that town a very closely knit enclave of people who were kind of thinking in the same way that we were. So I had at the same time this knowledge and this kind of local fame of my grandfather being very famous in Detroit and around the world, but really specifically in Detroit. He did a lot of work out there. But then also this very anti-Japanese climate of the town that we lived in and of the auto culture that dominated so much of that part of Detroit. So it was confusing, as you can imagine, and I didn't kind of learn about his big, his LA-based projects and a lot of his bigger work until much later. But what I wondered about when I myself started to study art, I started graduate school to pursue a career in art when I was 24. I didn't want to be an artist growing up because, my grandfather, it was too much pressure. My grandmother was like this, she was a Juilliard-trained concert pianist who, they got married 2 days before Pearl Harbor, so her career kind of went under. But my uncle won the Pulitzer Prize for documentary photography, and I felt like, I'm not going to do art. This is crazy. This is too much pressure. But I started to wonder a lot about his journey when I was in school because 2 days after I started graduate school was 9/11. And what we saw was that these buildings, that I grew up thinking of as like this great, achievement of my grandfather's, these buildings got turned into a piece of pro-war propaganda. And it was something that my family was so against, this war in Iraq, this anti-Muslim movement. And we knew that for my grandfather, he would have been devastated to see something that he worked so hard on turn into that. So I started thinking about symbols and I started thinking about stories. And I was, really into stories as a kid. We got to choose our school picture. What's your identity? And I was like, I'm a ravenous reader, But why in my library are there no books about people that look like my grandfather? Why does everybody know his story at my school or know that he's famous, but there's not a single book of a single Asian American in my entire library? So that planted a seed, and then another seed was planted when in 7th grade, my US history teacher, on December 7th, he said, "Katie, you're Japanese, why don't you tell this story of what happened today in history?" I said, wow, okay. So I told my class the story of how that night my great-grandfather, and many other Japanese and Japanese American men had been arrested throughout the west coast of California that night. And then in the following months, the vast majority of my family and many other families with the same background were arrested and put into prisons in the desert for where they stayed for 4 years. And I told him that story and how they lost their homes. Everybody here knows this story. And when I finished telling this story, my teacher says, "That never happened." And I said, "Yes, it did." He said, "No, it didn't." "Yes, it did." We went back and forth for a while, but I was not really raised to argue with my teacher. And so it kind of planted this other seed of like, not only are there no stories here about people who look like my grandfather or my grandmother, but there are people who are actually actively denying that these things happened. And I grew up in the 1980s, not the 1800s, and it made me think, wow, how many other communities and how many other groups of minority people in this country have this same thing happen to them on a constant basis? So these seeds were planted, and after 9/11, I was in a program for an MFA program for illustration. I started thinking, I should really tell this story, but I really wanted to make a lot of space between my grandfather's story and 9/11, because he has become most famous for buildings that least represent him. One being the World Trade Center, and one being a project called Pruitt-Igoe, which was like a pretty disastrous public housing project from the 1950s. But I kind of wanted to have a chance to explore the journey of what he went through to become an architect, what the world was like when he was forming, and how that kind of made him into how his journey kind of represents so many people's journeys from so many different places in the world. So I'm going to share the story with you now. Thank you. Thanks. If you take a look at a copy of the book, you'll see in the back there's possibly the longest author's note ever written in a children's book. It's like 5 pages long with lots of illustrations of specific buildings. So I hope you'll take a look at that. This is the second time I wrote a biography of my grandfather. The first one was in 3rd grade. I was very interested in him as this, I think I had this feeling of like, people are so negative where we live about Japanese people, but my grandpa is amazing. And so I did a biography for a project. And, I kind of knew the basics. I knew that he had designed the World Trade Center. I interviewed him. The first picture we looked at was me interviewing him. I was exploring the things that kids wonder about. What is your favorite color? White? That's not a color. But, what I came to be interested in, as an adult was, his favorite animal is a deer. You can see my drawing also hopefully has come a long way since then. But I became interested in his inner voice, and what he kind of told himself, given the context that he grew up in. Because it wasn't like he was kind of just designing regular standard buildings. He really wanted, his principles were, here's the Pacific Science Center, his principles were serenity, surprise, and delight. He would say he wanted people to step into a space and he would say, I want them to feel like this. And he would stretch out his arms and kind of that feeling of uplift. And it made me interested in his journey because, he was creating these workspaces, these studying spaces. This is the place in Detroit where people from everyday life could go and kind of have a fully human experience. He loved to build at a scale that most related to the kind of human experience of being in space. The arches were designed so that people would feel like the principles that he was focused on, serenity, surprise, and delight. But the world, as we all know, was not designed for him, was not designed for people from our community. And so I think a lot about, the fact that growing up where he did, surrounded by this really vibrant community in Seattle, maybe gave him a feeling of belonging that he didn't have in the outside world that he then wanted to replicate for other people. Where he lived was full of, creativity, was full of community. And so when he and his brother, Ken, when they were starting to step out into the world, the way that they had to do it, they both worked in these salmon canneries. That was how they paid for their public education. But the world was, he was thinking about buildings that he wanted to create, like aspirationally, the world was building this for his community. And you think about that contrast. This is what you deserve. This was the propaganda we've all seen it everywhere. This was the world that he was stepping into. And, when I talk to young people, when I talk to children, what was the world telling him when he was just starting out as an architect? Not only do we want you to live in these tiny barracks and feel this kind of repression and feel this kind of diminishment of your humanity or erasure of your humanity, but we actually don't even see you as a human being. I talk about it with the kids. What color is this person? He's green. This is animal-like. Oops. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Sorry. And also just to think about, like, in the context of his life, thinking about the context of our lives and who is now on the newspapers for with this similar messaging, and how can we keep an eye on it. And what I always hope is that when kids listen to this project, that's him and his brother again, they start to think about their own inner voice. What they tell themselves, no matter what the world is telling them. If the world is telling them these are the conditions that you deserve to live in. My family was sent to the Santa Anita racetrack as their first stop before going on to Granada. But even when the world tells you this, how do you transform that pain and transform that messaging into something much different. Okay? Because what's stunning to me when I look at these dates of his buildings and think about what was happening in the family, he was building buildings like this at Princeton University, or these spectacular kind of religious spaces, and this is suburban Michigan, where at the same time, when his parents passed away, they were not allowed to be buried. And those things, those assaults on somebody's humanity kind of take my breath away, and it just makes me wonder, what does that do to somebody's psyche? I find it so interesting, this is the St. Louis airport, and this is a medical records office building in Lansing, Michigan. And then, some more buildings around Detroit, and this is in Seattle, the Rainier Tower. He wanted people to go to work and have these experiences. He wanted people to go to work and be able to think their best thoughts. When he went to work, this is what he was doing until he became an architect. So those contradictions and how that cultivates somebody's driving force and motivation is always stunning. And I think there was also a part of his journey where he wanted to be seen. As a child, his teachers diminished him. The outside world diminished him, and he wanted to not be invisible. And that, of course, comes at a cost. In the book I reference, like him needing to rest his body, because when you are working to prove your humanity, that's a lot of hours. And it came at an expense to his health. Now, this story came after I probably worked on it for more than 20 years. There are a bunch of different versions of it. And I kind of wanted to figure out, when you tell your family story, I'm just one person in my family. I have 7 first cousins on that side, aunts and uncles. His cousins were all very connected. So, he died when I was 10 years old, so I didn't know him as an adult. I knew him as a child. So kind of diving into his story, I'm only telling kind of the version that I know from research, from reading all the books that have been written about him, from interviewing all the different people in our family. But I'm sure this happens in your family too. Everybody's story is a little bit different, and everybody's experience with that person is also a little bit different. So, I kind of, what I was focused on was extracting the essence of his work. And whenever I kind of settled on it, focused on this journey from childhood and the feeling he was trying to evoke in his architecture, I bring in my model. I kind of covered my studio walls with his work to kind of get into that space. And then just do my best to make his work and my work live on the page together. I'm mostly a painter, and if you've seen the mural in the back, my work and his work are very different, in terms of technique. He was a master draftsman. I do not love drawing buildings at all, which presents a problem, if you're doing a biography. I won't do any more architectural biographies, I can promise you that. But I felt like the only way to make it work would be to work in collage, using an X-Acto knife, painting the pieces, and then cutting them out, because paint felt like too loose of a medium. But it kind of, worked out. It's a much bigger picture book than a typical picture book size, because the publisher, they really wanted to let me have a lot of space. His work has a lot of space in it, and so they let me kind of create a lot of space. And so when this image in particular, when I talk to young people about it, we say, what do you notice? And they say things like, I notice that everybody has the same color skin and the same color hair and the same shape of eyes, and I notice that they're really crowded and it's dark, and there's a ton of fish, and so we talk about, and when I was working in Detroit or presenting in Detroit, 95% of the kids in the audience were African American, and they would say things like, I noticed that it reminds me of how when you look at conditions of enslavement, it was all people with the same color skin and some similar facial features doing terrible work, and so kind of teaching kids to develop that critical lens of, if you see something like that, it presents a problem, what can you do? So despite all of the differences, in our work, I think about this mural, which is right around the corner, and what we shared, and what his work has inspired me to want to do. And a lot of that has to do with creating spaces where people can feel fully human and feel fully seen. And a lot of the time, so that could be at a community like this spectacular community, which does not exist. I think probably everybody here lives in Los Angeles. When I was growing up, the only Japanese American people I knew were people I was related to. You know, there were no others. There was one other Asian American in the town who was my dad's close friend. He ran the video store, but there were no other Asian Americans. And when I came out here to JANM the first time, I had just graduated from college, and I felt like this exists. You know, not only is it this space, but there are generations of families just like mine. I'm fourth generation. And it felt like such a gift to kind of become aware of this community. And so to be able to come and do this mural was one of the most special, memorable events of my life. But I think that it was an opportunity also to feel connected to people who have suffered experiences of incarceration under different circumstances. And when I talk to kids about this, you know, it's like the idea, this is a correctional facility for teenage boys outside of Philadelphia. And we were working on the topic of identity. This was right after Trayvon Martin had died. And we were talking about how we see ourselves versus how people in our community see us. So for example, this boy, he was 16, you can see his name. How do you see yourself? Pink bubble. Get good grades, a good listener, DJ, peaceful, kind-hearted, humble, responsible, great kisser, I know how to dance, compassionate, okay? How do other people see you? How do people in your community see you? Or people on the street when you're walking down the street? Dumb, ugly, not gonna be anything, crazy, scary, bully, killer. You know, and what we know is that when people see each other so differently and so incorrectly that it's actually dangerous. You know, it's actually violent. And so kind of thinking back to the incarceration of our community and thinking about these teenage boys and when the difference between how sometimes in this country people are incarcerated for something that they've done that's very dangerous, and then a lot of the time people are incarcerated for who they are and how we can change that. So this mural was painted on cloth because the young men in the group, of course, were incarcerated, so they couldn't get out and have a voice in their community. So this was, you can see, oh yeah, right there. So we painted it on cloth. It's a special kind of like mural cloth that you then adhere to the wall so it looks like it was painted on the community, in the community. But it says, I am smart, kind-hearted, hardworking, all of these words. You know, a whole big group of young men did the same thing. And then it also says, is he? You know, is he smart? Is he kind-hearted? Is he compassionate? And kind of challenging the viewer to wonder, why am I even asking this? Who am I to judge this person, especially when it's so consequential? And it really made me think, and it always makes me think, a lot of the reason I do this work is because it makes me think about my own family. On the left is my maternal, my grandmother's side. My grandmother's the taller of the two girls on the right-hand side, my grandfather's family on the right. My grandmother's family came from Okinawa to Los Angeles, and my great-grandfather Anko, who's standing in the back, we have other family here from the same family, he ran a produce market. He was co-owner of a wholesale produce market in Los Angeles. So the night of December 7th, he was arrested because they thought he could be a spy. So I look at this family, you know, I look at my family, and I think about what would I do for my word bubbles, you know, hardworking, creative, loving, devoted, adventurous, open-hearted, all of these wonderful things. But what did other people think at that time? Spy, traitor, enemy. You know, my grandfather, when he was riding the subway in New York in the 1940s, somebody came up to him and they were like, are you Chinese or are you a Jap? You know, and you think, wow, you know, this was the world he was living in. And I think that all of the propaganda that was out at that time, you know, encouraging people to discern a Japanese American from a Chinese American by these awful terms, you know, Chinese, golden glow, Japanese, jaundiced, pale, sallow complexion, Chinese, long and lanky, Japanese, short and squat, just these kind of awful things people are asked to think about. You know, it just kind of makes me wonder, how has that transformed into like our modern times, and how can we focus on ways to see each other more clearly? So I work a lot in different correctional facilities or prisons in different parts, a lot in New York State, but this was my first one, which was actually in southern Mexico in Chiapas. So this was a women's prison where if you had a child under 4 and you were incarcerated, your child would come with you if you didn't have another place for them to go. And so they had brought me in there. I was there for a residency in that town, and then they kind of found out that I was there, and they said, "Oh, would you come and do a mural for the children?" They wanted me to paint like Disney characters on the wall or something, because it's kind of like where the children who live in that prison play. But when I got there, the mothers who spoke 26 languages other than Spanish mostly did not, and so that meant that they did not have any legal representation at all in their language, and 75% of them were there for reasons of domestic violence, having defended themselves. So pretty traumatic, incredibly traumatic circumstances. They wanted to tell their own story. They said, we want to feel like, even though this is not our home, we want to feel like our story is at least honored here. So we painted the mural. It was just over the course of like 5 days that kind of told the story of what they had been through, and what they hoped for themselves and for their communities. But what I think about with this and with our own community's history is just what happens. What are the intergenerational consequences of mass incarceration? No matter why someone's incarcerated, what then happens to their extended community? And so with these spaces, no matter where they are, what I hope is that people can kind of feel most seen and feel most fully themselves, because I don't think that's something that my grandfather grew with. This was a mural my most recent mural in Brooklyn, that's at a school for 100% children who have significant special needs. So the kids, I did a lot of workshops with the kids, and they wanted to show themselves as brave. This is all after the pandemic. They wanted to show themselves as brave and as kind of as strong. And the teachers and the staff, the paraprofessionals who work there, they wanted to show themselves as loyal and protective. So we picked this huge lion, which makes me wonder why I haven't done every mural with it, some kind of giant mammal, because the kids love it so much. But also kind of thinking about the world underneath our feet as constantly moving, and us constantly having to adapt in order to kind of protect the people who are most vulnerable. And I think that, like, at the end of the day, the thing I share most with my grandfather is this desire to kind of create spaces where people can, their inner voice and the outside world are aligned. The inner voice of like, I'm worthy, and the outside world of you are valued are aligned. Because my grandfather, I always think about like, what would he say when I have, hundreds of public school kids from every different background, what would he want these children to think? And what I believe is that he would want them to think, your life, for the fact of your existence, has incredible inherent value. Because he wasn't told that. He was told that in his community, but the outside world denied that every chance it had. And I think as a result of him needing to prove himself and prove his value, he worked hard at the expense of his emotional and physical well-being, at the expense of his family's well-being in a lot of cases, to prove that. And I hope that, like, what you hope is that he used to say to my dad and my aunt and uncle, why be the best in the world when you can be the best in the history of the world? That is not a healthy message to pass to your children. Of course you want your children to grow and find meaning in their work and do something important, but not at the expense of their humanity, and not because they're trying to prove that their life has value. So I think that he, with what I hope, he's long gone, so he can't actually weigh in on the book, but, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but my family tends to feel that the book represents him well, and what I hope is that the kids who read this book can absorb the fact that no matter how the world is right now, their life has incredible inherent value, and that they start whatever their journey is with that knowledge deep down inside, and with that inner voice kind of speaking most loudly to them. So that's the story. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments or anything. We have a mic too, but I don't know that we need it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I had a question about the fabric mural. It looks like he was lying under an Ojibwa Anishinaabe quilt.
Yes.
Were a lot of the young men Native American?
That is the first time anybody's asked that question, and I appreciate it so much. So this mural is called Heavy Blanket. So we studied 4 chapters of kind of incredible racism of the United States. So the purple, This represents Emmett Till, what he was kind of dragged down by. There are kind of quilting patterns from African American culture, water to represent Japanese American journey, and wood for the barracks. And then there's also some origami paper in here. And this was related to the Puerto Rican housing tenements, and then this was the indigenous, kind of from the indigenous and the Trail of Tears. So we went through with the programs that I usually do with murals are long in nature, so that there can be an educational component and a real participatory component. So it was kind of like the idea of how when you're reclining in that moment before you go to sleep or just as you're waking up, and you are under the weight of this heavy blanket of what is racism in the United States, how do you consider yourself? And how can we get the outside world to also consider yourself in the same way that you see yourself? Thanks for noticing that. Yeah. Yes.
Here, let me kind of.
Oh.
So you acknowledged how, your perspective on your grandfather is probably different than your family, or that you've got a great big family. Have they all read it? Do they all have
yeah.
differing opinions on it? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that was really amazing to work with my family on this because I've been working on the book for so long. They've all weighed in at different times. They all had very different experiences with my grandfather and also with his parents who lived with them for their whole life. In particular, my aunt and uncle. I think that what I tried to do, because he was a complicated family man, and I'll kind of leave that at that. But he was really good at his craft and really good at this kind of the essence of his work. And so that's what I kind of chose to focus on. But I have engaged my family a lot. My dad probably knew him the best because he worked with my grandfather for years at the architecture firm. So he was able to offer a lot of insight. Some of the stories you get from your parents or from your family don't always align, you know. Somebody says one thing, somebody says something else. There are a lot of truths that run through the current. So I also engaged historians who've studied him and architectural kind of academics who've written books on him just to kind of get the actual facts. But my family, I think that what's nice is that, my cousins, depending on who their parents were, it was my Uncle Taro or my Aunt Carol, they all had different stories passed down to them through their parents. And so this was a way to kind of focus a little bit less on the interpersonal family dynamics and more on what he was trying to do with the heart of his work, the essence of his work, based on his experience as a Japanese American man growing up in this country. So it was, when I finished the book, I'm very close with my father, and I had, given him his copy. And he called me and he said, we talk multiple times a week. And he said, I'd like to set up an appointment to talk to you spread by spread about the book. Oh no, but there were no surprises. I think for him, he would have liked the book to happen without World Trade Center and without Pruitt-Igoe, because for them, they remember being at home when my grandfather would receive these harsh reviews or would be going through a project that was really difficult and caused some suffering, some personal suffering. So their associations with certain projects are really different than mine, or than an architectural historian. So certain projects, he was like, don't put that in there. It was too hard on him. But it also, what I hope is that the young reader can see that life is so textured and there will be terrible moments, and then you keep moving through with them and you carry those. It's all part of the story. So thanks for that question. Yeah.
Any others?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Here, I'll pass the mic over.
I used to live in Seattle.
Okay.
So there's still a Nihonmachi, but it's a shadow of what it used to be during the
Right.
Depression when your grandfather was there.
Right.
Have you done this presentation in Seattle?
I'm
at the
going
Wing Loop?
to January 28th.
At the
So
Wing Loop?
yeah. I'm looking forward to that. I haven't spent as much time in Seattle that I have here, and I'm really looking forward to being out there and kind of exploring the Science Center. It's in partnership with Dencho and the Pacific Science Center, so in the Seattle Public Library. So that'll be really nice. Like I mentioned before, to be in these communities where there are multiple generations of Japanese Americans is a revelation, because I kind of grew up feeling like, oh, that's just us, I guess. Yeah, thanks. Yes. So here's the mic. Thank you.
What happens to the original artwork for the book? Are you displaying it or?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Right now, it's actually on display at the Brooklyn Public Library in the children's wing. And what was nice was that there was a book written about him, somebody named Justin Beal, who's become a friend, but he discovered that my grandfather worked on the Brooklyn Public Library when he was a very young architect. So they have since displayed all of the artwork from that. And after that, it will probably get packed up into a box and put in my studio. I'd wear it with all the other art from all my other books. I don't, it would be nice. I hope it gets displayed somewhere else. So we'll see. If you have any ideas, I welcome them. Thanks. So in the back, there are some activities for kids or anybody, kind of like design activities, and if they kind of go along with the book a little bit. But if you would like to, if you have a young person in your life that you would like to take that, with the book or without the book, I welcome you to do so. But I really appreciate, everybody coming today. It's really special to share this with you all. I know that this community meant a lot to him, and I know that after the war, he became a kind of symbol of success to a lot of people in the Japanese American community who had lost everything, because he had been in New York City and he hadn't lost everything. All of my grandmother's family had. His parents came to live with them, but this community has meant a lot to him since the day of his birth, and I feel I don't have that many opportunities to share with a community like this, and I'm so happy to be here with this book. So thank you all so much for coming and listening.